So, hello everyone, and more people are going to join, but I just want to introduce myself. My name is Antonia Tadic, and I'm saying hi from capital of Spain, Madrid. And today with me is one amazing developer, Navarr Barnier, who is going to talk about improving dependency tracking for Magento updates. Very interesting topic, very interesting for me, even though I'm a project manager with a technical background, but very interesting topic. And I'm very happy and excited to hear about. And I would like to give it the word to Navarr. I'm going to close my window so you don't see me so that you can focus fully on his presentation.
Thank you. So, as mentioned, we're going to go over improving dependency tracking for Magento updates. This topic is applicable outside of Magento as well, as long as you're using PHP and Composer. I've written these slides with consideration for both beginners and experts. Familiarity with Composer in Magento and the wider community might make some of the information a little repetitive, so I'm going to have to ask you to bear with me. But we'll end this with something brand new. So first, who am I? I'm Navarr Barnier. I'm currently a Magento developer at SwiftOtter, and I'm a member of the Magento Association Open Source Task Force, as well as a contributor to the PHP Framework Interop group. I started working with PHP in 2003 when I was still in high school and started using Composer in 2012. From there, I started working with Magento 1 in 2014, and I found it to be a huge downgrade from the work I was already doing, mainly because repositories were so huge, there were core edits all over the place, and a lot of that would have been avoidable with proper Composer support. So when I started working with Magento 2, I found the built-in Composer support to be a breath of fresh air. It was a huge improvement, and I began pushing the jobs I was in heavily to offload any work that could be offloaded into Composer. And I converted 2 companies in that process. We'll go over that methodology a few slides later. So I think that Composer, especially combined with Magento's rigid versioning rules, can really let us take control of our dependencies and how we track them. So we're going to start with a quick crash course. We're going to go over what Composer is for those who aren't aware. We'll go over how Magento utilizes it, and then I'm going to propose an addition to your development process for documenting dependencies. So first, what's Composer? Well, it's a dependency management tool. Projects that use dependency management tools like Composer end up being a bunch of small programs that all talk to each other. And this works out because we have public APIs. There are specific parts of the programs that we can rely upon, given that the project follows a proper versioning system. Magento does all of this, and it's pretty great for it. So when we use Composer, we get some benefits. We get version resolution. All those little tiny programs can depend on different compatible versions of the same modules, and then Composer will pick the latest of them that's compatible with everything else. This allows your dependencies also to be stored outside of your version control system, which puts less data on the wire. It allows you to commit to your code base quicker, and oftentimes it can result in quicker deployments. So how does Magento use it? Well, every Magento module is its own small program. Magento's core modules also have a documented public API, so you know how you can rely on them. And then they've documented out their versioning system pretty well. So a lot of you might say you already use Composer to install your third-party modules. And that's probably true for a lot of them. But is it true for all of them? Is it really? Where do you put your own code? Have you ever had Magento break because a class changed? You didn't receive any warning, and you just sort of happened upon it either during an upgrade or hope that you happen upon it during an upgrade instead of live on production. So what I'm going to have to ask you to do is to forget the old way. An alternative title for this section could be called App Code Considered Harmful. We're not in Magento 1 anymore, and we should stop acting like it. So move to Composer. And what will that get you? Well, it'll get you a few improvements when you use it for your first and third-party modules. We can add automatic patching during the Composer installation process. And we can know where to start looking for any possible breakages during an upgrade just based on the dependency constraints. In addition to that, using those dependency constraints ensures that Magento modules aren't disabled when they're needed by other modules, as long as you're using the module enable and module disable commands. So how do we use it with our first and third-party modules that don't already have Composer repositories? We use a path repository instead of app code. By using this */ pattern for the URL, you can even put them into this alternative folder in a similar format to app code. It's pretty simple. So with that how, we can go over these improvements in a little bit more depth. For automatic patching, I think a lot of us are already familiar with Sweeken's Composer patches. The example that I have here on the slide would go in your root composer.json folder. And it's often great for fixing bugs in a third-party module, or perhaps pulling a patch down from the Magento GitHub and installing it before it's in the quality patch system. To be fair, you don't really gain this benefit if you're on Magento Cloud, where you already have the M2 hotfixes directory and the ECE tools. But you still get safer upgrades. In your modules composer.json, you'd put in, a line like this, and this would, first of all, prevent you from running module disable Magento gift card as long as your module's still enabled. And it would prevent any upgrades to the module gift card module without you updating this version constraint. And we want to do that because if we pick our numbers correctly, it'll tell us when our module is likely to break. So along that route, we can go over what the numbers mean, the versioning policy. Now, Magento uses a variant of semantic versioning for their modules, and they do it only for the modules. They don't do it for their product version number. So the version 2.4.4 will mean very little in the context of this slide. But they have 4 different levels of versioning. First, you have your major version. That's reserved for any breaks to API annotated classes that are not backwards compatible with callers. You have your minor version, which increments anytime there's new functionality or customization point changes. And this is also for any backwards compatibility breaks, not with calling classes, but with implementing them. And then you have what's traditionally referred to as the patch version. This is where backwards compatible bug fixes go. And then finally, you have the security patch version in Magento, typically called the build indicator. And it's incremented only to prevent conflict with the next Magento product release so that those 2 branches can happen simultaneously. Sometimes, instead of this security patch version, you'll see a stability version, such as beta or release candidate. But those are unimportant in this context. And all the really in-depth information on this can be found on DevDocs. Now, we can apply that knowledge to our internal modules, which will let us begin assessing our upgrade risk without knowing the modules, and it will allow us to catch potential backwards compatibility breaks during the upgrade process without opening up our browser and without running MFTF tests. That said, it comes with some downsides, right? If you were listening carefully, you would have heard me mention potential backwards compatibility breaks. A change to the API of a module you rely on doesn't necessarily mean that it will affect your code. There's always a hard balance between module separation and API coverage, and that'll never be perfect. Depending on the type of project you're working on, figuring out the right requirement to use can also take a chunk of time. If you're working on just a website being stood up, that goes pretty easily. You look at the version you've currently got installed and you use that as a base requirement. If you're working on a multi-website module, for example, or something that you hope to put on the Magento marketplace, supporting this gets a bit tougher. When I was working on the Vertex module, for example, it often meant that I would need to view multiple tags of the Magento code base, double check the version in the module that I'm relying on's composer.json file, and just do that over and over, make sure that the code was still right and what I needed was still there. It was lengthy, but it helped me ensure the versions I declared support for would continue to work. And of course, the biggest downside is that fixing those requirements when it comes time to upgrade also takes time. Even if there are no code changes you have to make, you still have to change the requires line. Those downsides continue to be applicable with what I'm about to introduce you to. But we have some ways to sort of make them easier on ourselves. So if you're already doing this today, using your third-party modules and your first-party modules in Composer, that's fantastic. But what do you do when it's time to upgrade your version of Magento and you have a version conflict? Do you investigate what the cause of that conflict is, or do you just increase the version number and test it in your browser? I think it's tough to admit, but a lot of us do that. And why wouldn't we? It's an immense pain to dredge through the code and see how we're using that module to change it, right? It'd probably be fine if we were running a full suite of MFTF tests against the code base afterwards, but I bet a lot of us still aren't doing that yet. So how can we improve this process? We build better tools. That's what developers are best at, right? One such tool being a new PHP attribute. Sorry. What would such an attribute need? Well, it would need to clearly mark what modules our dependencies come from. It would need to define how it is we depend on those modules. So my proposal would be to start using a dependency attribute. The one I'm showing here defines the module that we're depending on. It shows what the version constraint we've decided is. And most importantly, to the context of this whole talk, is that it says why we're dependent on that version constraint. In this example, it's because we're relying on the data object's magic methods. That's part of the Magento API, and it could change if that major number increments. This attribute can be placed in any location that accepts the PHP attribute, with the ideal location being as close to the coded effects as possible. Now, all that said, this is only useful if you have tooling that recognizes it. So I did what anyone would do. I built the tool. This here is a Composer plugin and standalone CLI tool that describes what dependency attributes would block a given version of a Composer package. Its output looks like this. This clearly shows which file wants to block the requested version. It shows the documented reason for requiring the versions that it does, and it shows where you've placed that attribute, and it shows the versions the file wants to limit itself to. In the above example, we now know that we're dependent on the Magento API. We can verify that the magic methods still work, and once we've verified those, we update our version constraints in composer.json and update the attribute. It's pretty simple, and it takes a lot of that heavy lifting off when you want to do things properly. That said, there's still a lot of ways that this tool can be improved. You know, this is only the start. Once you've started using the attribute and perhaps started using the tooling, we can add more to our process. We can add stuff like reactionary testing, where on pull requests, you make sure that the updates to composer.json don't conflict with the attributes that are written in the code. Some preemptive testing, where you run static analysis tooling on your code that checks if you've started using any third-party classes that you weren't before, and make sure that you have your requirements written there in the code, in the attributes. And then, of course, just basic tooling improvements like searching down the entire dependency chain to see if there's anything down there that might cause problems when you upgrade a module. So a quick reminder of what you can do currently today. You can use the dependency attribute, and you can consider installing my tool. If you have any questions, go ahead and post them in the Q&A tab now. If you have any questions later, feel free to post them in the McHat Developer Community Dependency Annotation Chat Room, or in the Dependency Annotation Chat Room in Magento Community Engineering on Slack. And of course, you can contribute or simply follow along with the tool's progress on GitHub.
Perfect. Guys, if you have some questions, let's ask them now. We have enough time to answer them all. And while people are going to go and ask the questions, I just want to comment some comments here. Navarr, if we can do it. Joseph says, path repos were crippled in 2.3, a file because logic to validate the real path against the web root was added, which disallows symlinks to outside directories. What do you have any comments on that?
I mean, that's true, right? I think path repositories outside of your Magento installation path have always been a little crippled. I don't think that's applicable if you keep your path repositories inside your Magento root and you keep you keep the pub directory as the public facing web root. I think you should still be able to use path repositories, and I haven't had any problems doing it that way.
Good. Joseph is asking a question, so I'm going to read it, and then I'm going to read some other things. He's saying or asking, wouldn't those attributes be a nightmare to maintain if you use the same one in the multiple places?
They can be, yeah, and that's sort of the pros and cons that you're weighing against when you take this. If you're using it in the same class over and over again, you could put just one attribute at the top of the class on top of the class. But yeah, it does have some minor maintenance problems, but I think using an attribute like this lends itself to being a much better solution than sort of the praying and going that a lot of us are currently doing.
Good. Pavlo saying, just a note, adding third party is better to add as a zip archive, and Composer will still install it, will force developers not to touch that module. What's your outtake on that?
I absolutely agree. In such a case, you wouldn't use a path repository, but an artifact repository, and you'd point to the folder that you're installing those in. I think some third-party modules, though, aren't in the proper format for that, so you really have to know which one to use as the case demands.
Good. Pablo, do you have maybe another question? We have 25 people actually listening to this session, so it would be great, guys, if you can ask a couple of more questions. I see many people liking the Joseph Liddy question, so let's keep asking, because this is such a great topic and a hard one to do it in the right way. Raphael said, so much to learn. Correct. What else we have here? Let's wait for some more questions. And people are liking Joseph Liddy questions. Question.
It was a good one, yeah.
Yeah, it was a good one. Is there anything else, Navarr, now that we have some questions or something that pop-ups in your mind that you would like to mention that maybe was over in the presentation while we wait a little bit more?
Yeah, while we wait for more questions is also probably a good opportunity to point out the Magento upgrade tooling that's recently come out. I think it came out while I was initially working on this talk and tool. and it can also point to some problems that you might have later down the line with Magento updates. So if you haven't heard about that, definitely go look it up on the Adobe Commerce Dev Docs as well.
Have you already been using that tool?
I've tested it a little bit, but haven't had the opportunity to fully use it.
Mm-hmm. And then what's your intake on what you saw so far? What are the because like with everything, there is a good points and there are some points that could be improved. So what is your, let's say, honest feedback on what you have been able to see? Obviously, keeping in mind that you didn't use it properly, so maybe the feedback is still early, but
yeah. And it was more when it was still in, I think it was still in beta at the time.
Mm-hmm.
But with my experience with that tool, it gave a lot of information, perhaps more than was necessary, or maybe some that are kind of like false positives. It's definitely something that's ripe for improvement, maybe alongside of the tooling I presented today, or maybe by itself. But also there's a lot of work that needs to be done in the Magento framework to really make sure that a lot is API annotated and reliable to developers.
Mm. And do you have a feedback how many people so far has used your tool?
I haven't really looked into that very much. I think it's still mostly unknown. This is the first real presentation to a wider audience.
Okay. And how long you when it was out, like let's say the first stable version that was out, it was something like a couple of months ago, or you have it for some time?
I had a previous version which didn't use PHP 8 attributes. And a side note is that PHP attributes are compatible with PHP 7 as long as there's still a single line. They're treated just as if they were inline comments. But a previous version used annotations, sort of like in your PHP doc blocks. And I think I did that maybe late 2019 or early 2020 with the stable release using PHP 8 attributes, either late 2020 or early this year.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so it's pretty new.
Pretty new.
Mm. And before that, before you come up with your tool, what is the thing that you were using, or you from the beginning you started to say, okay, there is no proper thing to use, so I'm gonna build by myself the way I want?
Precisely that. I started using a PHP doc annotation. And then later I'm like, I bet I could make a tool that would pull all this together and really improve it. So it was my work specifically on the Vertex bundled extension that led me to deciding that we needed something to cover this and building this tool and attribute.
When you say Vertex extension, which come up to my attention because as a project manager, I was working on the project that we needed to integrate Vertex model with Magento. It was quite interesting because we had lots of actually additional custom things. Have you been working on Vertex on that model specifically, or you were building a custom model for your company, or you were contributing to Magento? Can you give me some details on that? Because you mentioned it a few times.
Yeah, at my previous place of employment, I was the lead developer on the Vertex bundled extension.
Okay, and this is the model that right now Magento is using, or it was just a model for the company that was using?
It's the one that Magento is using.
Oh, well, very nice. I was working on that model. I mean, in terms of managing, so it's actually quite good. But what we were implementing was quite complex. So, but it's a correct model. Yeah, you're welcome. Do we have some more questions? We have 22 people. So people are listening. People are not going out of this session, which is a great sign. But maybe we can ask some questions because we have this opportunity to ask. We can ask some hard questions as well. I believe that Navarr is ready to answer them. So let's ask. We have 5 minutes more left. It will be great. least one more question. Let's keep it low expectation. One more question. Oh, Pablo is gonna join, so I'm gonna allow him to join. So he
All
can.
right.
Oops, I don't know. Pablo,
Maybe
can
it
you?
was an accident.
Maybe it was an accident, but Pablo, can you do it again? What you did, so that we can add you to. If you want to, well, join in person, you can join as well, or you can ask the question in the chat, or you. Okay, I'm going to invite him to this video call. No, not private, not that one. Um, Pablo, maybe you want to ask some question? Because he was here down, being like he wants to join. And I click it, yes, but I don't know what happened. Let's see. I'm going to ask him in the chat. We have a question. Pranav is asking, is there any guide for beginners? I guess the beginners with Magento or beginners with this process?
So I believe it's covered pretty decently on the GitHub repository, which is basically just to start using the attribute, as well as in the earlier slides when we talked about how to figure out, which modules you want to depend on. I believe the recording of this will be available later on the Magento Association website, so you can look that up again.
Mm-hmm. And when you say in the GitHub, you meaning on your GitHub that we see now in front?
The one on screen.
Okay, so that's one thing. And then we have Pablo is asking the question. Thank you, Pablo. Is asking, if to be short, how do you handle version management? Example, developer is working on a task and needs to work in a few models at the same time.
So assuming those are custom modules that they're working on that all sort of depend on each other, you really need to work hard to tear out some common functionality into their own separate modules that you can then API annotate and depend on. And it can be really an effort in sort of doing things the right way, pulling out the right functionality. It's not an easy task, but it can be done. And in such cases, once you have that common functionality pulled out and you have it API annotated, then my best recommendation would be to go to the dev docs and use the same sort of versioning policy that Magento does. I think that works pretty great for any Magento modules specifically. For sort of external things, I might suggest putting in a composer provides directive, and then having a difference between your API for callers and your API for implementers.
Mm.
And different versions for each of those.
I have a question. Just before that, I just want to say that we are 1 minute out of the time, but you can still stay if you have some more questions. There is some more questions. One moment. Or you can go to another session. This session is not going to be closed. We can stay a little bit more and have some questions. No problem. Pavlov is rephrasing. Do you release? So he wants to rephrase his questions because maybe we didn't understand it correctly. Do you release every task separately or create a release candidate which can include few? Well, in my company, we do release candidates, I can tell.
Mm-hmm. We sort of did the same thing with Vertex when submitting to Magento. We would submit a release candidate that had a lot of different fixes involved in them, as opposed to a release per fix. And I think you'll probably do that most of the time, just because you should be running MFTF tests afterwards and making sure that everything's clear. So just sort of having a I forget the terminology, but a period of time where you start work, you end work, you run tests, and then release a version is a lot more beneficial than make a fix, release a version, make a fix, release a version, especially when it comes to the amount of effort that can be required in manual acceptance testing.
Pablo, are you happy with the answer? I have one question, and then we can wrap it up. He said thanks. Many people say thank you, excellent presentation, thank you. My question is the last question. I have a feeling that dealing with these type of things, like the topic that you are talking about, developer needs to be extremely organized. Have like organizational skills in terms of organizing the code, organizing this, making sure that you don't mess up. How much is important aside of having a good mind and being like a very intelligent in terms of coding. You need to be, I assume you need to be very well organized.
So you do. You do need to be pretty well organized, and I am not, and I feel like a lot of us aren't, even though we should be, which is why I created a tool like this, because it sort of provides a methodology to improve organization and sort of enforce that organization where you might not otherwise be organized.
Yeah, that's a great thing. Yeah. So you are solving your problem, actually. Manipulating kind of yourself in order to have less problems.
Yep.
Okay, well, thank you so much. It was a great presentation. It was a very interesting topic. People enjoyed it very much. We had some questions, and everyone that you want to use it or you have some questions, you can directly ask Navarr in here chat. You can set up a private session with him if you want to have one-on-one and you were not feeling maybe comfortable speaking or asking the question. But please go ahead and check out his module, kind of, let's say, that he built. And let us know the feedback on the in the community, because that's exactly what we need. Thank you once again, and thanks everyone for listening, and have a great day and great night, depending on where you are.
Yep. And as written on the slide, I'm available for any questions or feedback in all of those areas. So thank you for coming.
Thank you. Bye-bye.